Some bloodlines carry more than just names. They carry curses, secrets, and the echoes of sins that never die. In 1846 Pennsylvania, the Dellinger family lived behind tall iron gates and whispered reputations. To outsiders, they were wealthy, powerful, and untouchable. But inside their ancestral mansion, a dark inheritance ruled them all, one that demanded blood from every heir who dared to claim it. Their history wasn't written in love or legacy, but in madness, betrayal, and death. Before we uncover this haunting true story of the Dellinger line, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure to subscribe, because every story I bring you is the result of long nights digging through real archives, verified accounts, and historical truths that were meant to stay buried. The origins of the Dellinger family stretch back to the earliest days of Pennsylvania's settlement, a time when the land was wild, untamed, and full of both promise and peril. In the late 1700s, when most settlers struggled just to survive, the first Dellinger patriarch, Heinrich Dellinger, arrived from Germany with little more than a few coins, a Bible, and a mysterious chest no one was ever allowed to open. He was a quiet, calculating man who seemed to rise faster than anyone around him. Within a decade, he owned hundreds of acres of fertile farmland, a large estate house on the outskirts of Lancaster County, and influence in the small but growing community. How he gained his wealth so quickly was something no one could ever fully explain. The locals said Heinrich was a man who never prayed in public and never attended church. Yet every Sunday night, smoke and flickering light could be seen coming from the old barn at the edge of his property. Some said he was conducting strange rituals. Others whispered that he had made a pact, something dark, something ancient, to secure his family's fortune. Whatever the truth was, his success couldn't be denied. He became one of the wealthiest landowners in Pennsylvania, his fields thriving even in years when others' crops withered. It was as if luck itself bowed to the Dellinger name. When Heinrich died in 1802, his funeral drew the entire town. But something unsettling happened that day. The family refused to let anyone see the body. The coffin remained sealed, and the service was brief and cold. That night, a thunderstorm rolled across the valley, and a bolt of lightning struck the family's barn, burning it to ashes. Nothing was ever found inside except the warped remains of a large iron ring set into the ground, its purpose unknown. From that night forward, strange things began to surround the Dellinger estate. His son, Tobias Dellinger, inherited both the land and the eerie silence that came with it. He expanded the estate, built a grand stone mansion, and continued to grow the family's fortune through mining and trade. But with that fortune came tragedy. Workers often died mysteriously in the mines, accidents no one could explain. The Dellingers always paid the widows generously, but the deaths kept happening. When one miner's wife accused Tobias of hiding something in the tunnels, she vanished a week later. Rumors spread that the family's wealth was tied not to hard work, but to something unholy buried deep beneath their land. By the early 1800s, the Dellingers had become a family both admired and feared. They held lavish gatherings, their home filled with music and fine wine, yet there was always an undercurrent of unease. Guests spoke of hearing whispers in the halls and cold draughts that seemed to come from nowhere. Portraits of the family lined the grand staircase, each heir painted with the same cold eyes and solemn expression, as if every Dellinger carried the same haunting awareness of what their name truly meant. The family's success was undeniable, but so was the darkness that seemed to follow it. Every generation inherited not just the Dellinger wealth, but the weight of something unseen, something Heinrich Dellinger may have unleashed long ago. The land that had made them rich also seemed to claim a piece of them with each passing decade. By 1846, when the next generation of heirs came of age, the Dellinger estate stood as both a monument to power and a warning, a place where prosperity had been built on a foundation soaked in secrets, whispers, and blood. It was from these origins that the curse of the Dellinger line would take root, a legacy that would destroy everyone who carried its name. The first heir's violent death marked the beginning of what would come to be known as the Dellinger curse, a chain of tragedy that no wealth or power could escape. In the spring of 1846, the Dellinger estate was preparing for the wedding of Heinrich's grandson, Elias Dellinger, the only surviving heir of Tobias Dellinger. Elias was young, ambitious, and deeply proud of the family name. Unlike his ancestors, he was well liked in the nearby town of Ephrata. He often donated to the church, employed locals, and was even rumored to be in love with a schoolteacher named Clara Whitmore, a woman far below his social standing. For a brief time, it seemed the Dellinger line might finally find peace. But peace was never meant for that family. According to surviving letters and local accounts, Elias began to change in the months before his death. Servants noticed him wandering the halls at night, muttering to himself or staring into the darkness for hours. He claimed to hear voices in the old barn ruins, the same place where his grandfather's strange gatherings had once taken place. He told Clara that he often dreamt of a shadowed man offering him great power in exchange for something he could never name. At first, people thought it was stress or exhaustion, but soon his behavior became more erratic. He dismissed longtime workers without reason, smashed mirrors throughout the house, and even burned the family Bible, claiming it had been corrupted by lies. Then came the night of May 14th. 1846, a night that would forever stain the Dellinger name. The Dellinger mansion was filled with guests celebrating Elias's upcoming marriage. Music echoed through the halls, candles flickered across the long dining table, and laughter drifted into the garden. By all accounts, Elias seemed cheerful, even charming. But as the evening went on, he excused himself, saying he felt unwell. Minutes later, the sound of screaming shattered the air. When guests rushed to the upper floor, they found Elias in his father's study, drenched in blood. The scene was horrifying. Elias stood over the body of his uncle, Thomas Dellinger, holding a silver letter opener like a dagger. His eyes, witnesses said, were empty, as if something else was looking through him. He did not resist arrest. In fact, he reportedly laughed as he was dragged away, repeating one chilling phrase over and over: "The blood will feed the land." Those words would echo through generations of Dellingers to come. He was declared insane and confined to an asylum in Philadelphia, where he would die 3 months later under mysterious circumstances. The official report listed it as suicide, but the physician's notes suggested something stranger. His body was found with symbols carved into his chest, symbols that match markings found in the burned barn decades earlier. After Elias's death, the Dellinger family's reputation began to crumble. Clara Whitmore disappeared shortly afterward, and her body was never found. Locals whispered that she had been taken by the same darkness that claimed Elias, while others believed she had fled in fear of what she'd seen that night. Servants began quitting in droves, claiming to hear footsteps and whispers echoing through the halls after midnight. Even the family's animals grew restless. Horses refused to approach the stables, and dogs howled at the empty barn ruins until dawn. The tragedy was seen by many as divine punishment, a reckoning for the sins of the Dellinger ancestors. For the first time, people spoke openly about the family's rumored pact, the one Heinrich had made generations before. Church leaders declared the estate cursed, and no priest would perform services there again. The Dellinger mansion, once a symbol of power and prosperity, became a place of dread. Elias's violent death was only the beginning. It was the first drop of blood in what would become a flood of horror, a death that bound every future heir to the same fate. What had once been superstition was now undeniable. Every Dellinger born after Elias was doomed to die violently, as if the land itself demanded a price for the fortune it had given. The curse had awakened, and it would not sleep again. After Elias Dellinger's death, the once proud estate fell into a heavy silence, a kind of stillness that felt less like peace and more like waiting. The Dellinger family withdrew from public life, closing off their mansion from the world outside. Curtains were drawn at all hours, visitors were turned away, and rumours spread through the nearby towns of Ephrata and Lancaster that something unnatural was stirring on the Dellinger land. But the true horrors were only beginning. Elias's younger sister, Margaret Dellinger, became the reluctant heir to the family's cursed fortune, and her story would drive the legend deeper into Pennsylvania's darkest history. Margaret was known to be intelligent, refined, and deeply devout. Unlike her brother, she had no interest in power or wealth. She spent much of her time reading scripture, caring for the estate's dwindling staff, and keeping the household running after Elias's scandal. Yet even she couldn't escape the shadow that loomed over her bloodline. According to letters later found in the Dellinger archives, Margaret began hearing voices, soft, familiar whispers that seemed to come from the old barn ruins at the edge of the property. At first, she ignored them, thinking grief had driven her to delusion, but the whispers grew stronger, and soon they spoke her name. One night in October 1848, Margaret confided in the family's aging servant, a woman named Ruth, who had served the Dellingers for over 40 years. Ruth told her something she would never forget. She said that Heinrich Dellinger, the first patriarch, had not died peacefully, as the family claimed. On his deathbed, he had screamed for forgiveness, clawing at the air and begging someone or something to release him. The master bargained with darkness, Ruth said, and it never forgot. Margaret reportedly laughed at the time, brushing it off as an old woman's superstition. But within weeks, she stopped leaving her room altogether. The estate workers began noticing strange signs. Candles burned down to nothing in seconds, mirrors cracked on their own, and a cold draught swept through the halls, even when the fires blazed high. The servants swore they saw figures standing at the edge of the woods, silent, unmoving shapes that vanished if approached. Margaret's health began to deteriorate. She lost weight, stopped sleeping, and spent hours sitting by the window, staring toward the ruins of the barn. On several occasions, she was heard whispering to someone, though she was alone. "I won't continue it," she was once heard saying. "I won't give you another." By December, Ruth found her in a state of near madness. Margaret had covered the walls of her room with charcoal markings, symbols that matched the ones carved into Elias's chest before his death. When asked what they meant, she replied, "He told me these will keep them out." The next morning, Ruth found Margaret dead. There were no signs of struggle or violence, only the faint scent of burnt wood and ashes in the room. Her Bible was open to a single verse: "The sins of the father shall be visited upon the children." After Margaret's death, the few remaining staff members fled. The mansion was abandoned, left to rot under creeping vines and silence. But neighbors swore they could still see lights flickering in the windows late at night, soft orange glows like candles moving from room to room. Farmers passing by claimed to hear a woman's voice crying for help, followed by the low, guttural whisper of a man answering her. None dared to go near after dark. Margaret's death sealed what the townspeople already believed. The Dellinger family was cursed beyond redemption. Her passing marked the third unnatural death in the bloodline within 10 years. The fortune that had once brought them glory had become their greatest burden, consuming every heir who dared to inherit it. To outsiders, it was just a tragic coincidence. But to those who lived near the Dellinger estate, it was proof that Heinrich's pact still demanded payment. The Dellinger legacy was no longer one of success or pride. It was a name spoken only in whispers, a reminder that some bloodlines are born under a shadow that no prayer can ever lift. By the early 1850s, the Dellinger estate had become a place of desolation, a hollow monument to a family that had once stood at the center of Pennsylvania's prosperity. The mansion, once bright with laughter and guests, was now a tomb of memories. Its windows were cracked, the gardens had grown wild, and the gates stood rusted from years of neglect. But even in its decay, The estate refused to be forgotten. Travelers who passed along the old Lancaster Road claimed they could still see smoke rising from the estate's chimneys at dawn, even though no one had lived there for years. And soon, a new generation of Dellingers would be drawn back to that cursed land, unable to escape the call of their blood. The next heir to bear the Dellinger name was Jonathan Dellinger, a distant cousin who had inherited the property after Margaret's mysterious death. Jonathan was a man of reason, a scholar and skeptic who had spent years studying at the University of Pennsylvania. He dismissed the family's dark legends as superstition, stories crafted by fearful townsfolk. Determined to restore the family's name, he moved into the abandoned mansion in the autumn of 1852. His first letters to colleagues were filled with confidence, describing the property as a grand old ruin, ripe for restoration. But within months, his tone changed. Jonathan began reporting strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, doors slamming in the night, and whispers that seemed to echo through the empty halls. He initially dismissed them as tricks of the mind, the result of isolation and sleeplessness. Yet his accounts became increasingly disturbing. In one letter, he described hearing footsteps in the upstairs corridor every night at exactly 2:13 a.m., the same time Elias Dellinger had murdered his uncle 6 years earlier. In another, he wrote, of finding fresh footprints in the dust leading to Margaret's old room, though no one else lived in the house. Neighbors soon began to notice Jonathan's change. Once social and articulate, he grew pale and withdrawn, avoiding town entirely. The local pastor, Reverend Keller, visited him after receiving a desperate note that read only, "The house remembers." When the Reverend arrived, he found Jonathan sitting by the fireplace, muttering about debts of blood and voices from beneath the earth. He claimed to have discovered old ledgers belonging to Heinrich Dellinger, filled with names, symbols, and dates, records of payments and offerings. Jonathan believed the original Dellinger fortune had been secured through a ritual sacrifice, one that required a life to be taken from each generation to keep the land fertile and the family prosperous. When Keller tried to reason with him, Jonathan only laughed and said, "It doesn't matter if I believe. It believes in me." That was the last time anyone saw him alive. Days later, townsfolk noticed black smoke rising from the Dellinger estate once again. When authorities arrived, they found the mansion's front doors wide open and the stench of burning flesh thick in the air. Jonathan's body was discovered in the old barn ruins, his hands bound, his chest marked with the same sigils found in Elias's and Margaret's rooms. A circle of ash surrounded him, and in its center lay the family's crest, carved into the dirt. The official report called it suicide, though the coroner noted something chilling. Jonathan's body showed no signs of fire damage, despite being surrounded by scorched wood and embers. His eyes were wide open, his expression frozen in terror, as if he had seen something no human should ever see. After Jonathan's death, no one dared set foot on the Dellinger property again. The estate was left to rot completely, swallowed by ivy and time. Yet the stories never stopped. Locals claimed that on certain nights the mansion's windows still glowed with a faint, flickering light. Some said they could hear the sound of a man's voice shouting from the barn, followed by screams and the smell of smoke drifting through the trees. Others swore that when they passed by the property gates, they could hear a whisper calling their name, soft and desperate, like the house itself was hungry for another Dellinger to come home. Jonathan's death confirmed what the townspeople had always believed. The Dellinger line was cursed, not by coincidence or madness, but by something darker, something ancient that had taken root in the soil of Pennsylvania and fed on the blood of its heirs. The curse was not fading, it was growing stronger, waiting for the next descendant to return and continue the legacy written in blood. After Jonathan Dellinger's mysterious death in 1852, the estate stood untouched for nearly a decade. nature began to reclaim what had once been a symbol of wealth and influence. The ivy climbed over the cracked stone walls, trees grew through. The collapsed roof of the barn and the iron gates rusted until they hung half open, like the mouth of a corpse. Locals avoided the area completely. Even hunters refused to cross the boundary lines, claiming the woods around the property were unnaturally still. No birds sang, no animals stirred, as if the land itself held its breath. But the Dellinger curse was not content to sleep. It was waiting, and when the next heir was born, it awoke again. The child, Samuel Dellinger, was the last surviving blood relative of the line, a boy born to a distant branch of the family that had settled in Philadelphia. His mother, Eliza. Dellinger never wanted to speak of the family estate, but the name still carried weight. When her husband died in an industrial accident in 1861, she had no choice but to claim the inheritance that came with her bloodline. With nowhere else to go, she packed her belongings and brought young Samuel, only 10 years old, back to the old Dellinger mansion in rural Pennsylvania. From the moment they arrived, the boy was uneasy. He told his mother the air tasted like metal, and he refused to sleep in the upstairs rooms, saying someone kept whispering to him through the walls. Eliza, determined to rebuild her life, ignored the warnings of the townspeople and began restoring parts of the house. She hired local workers to clean and repair what they could, but one by one they quit after hearing strange noises, crying, footsteps in empty rooms, and the low creak of rocking chairs moving on their own. One worker even claimed to have seen a man standing in the upstairs window, though no one was inside. Still, Eliza stayed. She believed that faith and reason could conquer superstition, but Samuel's behavior grew increasingly disturbing. He would talk to himself for hours, often staring at the fireplace or into the mirror. He said he had made a friend named Eli, a pale man who promised to teach him the old ways of the family. At first, Eliza thought it was an imaginary friend, a coping mechanism for the loss of his father. But one night she awoke to find Samuel standing beside her bed, holding one of Heinrich Dellinger's old ledgers, the same book Jonathan had written about before his death. The boy whispered, "He showed me where it is, Mama. The mark is still in the barn." Terrified, Eliza forbade him from going near the ruins, but the next morning she found footprints leading from the house to the barn and back again. In the days that followed, Samuel's health began to decline. His eyes grew hollow, and he complained of nightmares where men in the walls called his name. He said the land was angry because the offering had been forgotten. Then, on the night of October 3rd, 1862, Eliza was awakened by screams. She rushed to Samuel's room and found the bed empty. The front door was wide open, the cold wind howling through the house. When she reached the barn, she saw something that shattered her sanity. The ruins were glowing faintly, the ground smouldering as if fire burned just beneath the soil. In the center stood Samuel holding a candle. His eyes rolled back. Around him, drawn in ash and blood, was the same circle found near Jonathan's body. He was chanting in a language she couldn't understand. Eliza ran to him, screaming his name. But as she crossed the circle, the candlelight went out and everything went silent. The next morning, a farmer found Eliza wandering along the road barefoot and covered in soot. She couldn't speak, only whispering, "He's gone. He's gone." When the authorities searched the property, they found no trace of Samuel. The only thing left was the burned outline of a small figure on the barn floor. Eliza was sent to a sanitarium in Harrisburg, where she lived the rest of her life in a state of quiet madness. Her final words before she died in 1871 were written in a trembling hand. "The blood remembers, the house remembers, the heir will always return." Samuel's disappearance marked the darkest chapter of the Dellinger curse. No one ever claimed the estate again. It was left to rot, a place of whispers and ghosts, where every leaf seemed to carry the echo of screams long silenced. Those who dared to venture near after dusk swore they could see a small boy standing in the barn ruins, candle in hand, staring out into the night, waiting for the next Dellinger heir to come home. The years following Eliza and Samuel Dellinger's return to the cursed estate were filled with strange occurrences that would haunt the small Pennsylvania community for generations. Locals claimed that ever since the boy vanished, the land itself had changed. The fields around the mansion grew barren, trees twisted into unnatural shapes, and an eerie mist clung to the ground even on clear nights. The Dellinger property became a place no one dared to approach after sunset. What had once been a proud estate was now a living wound in the heart of the valley, one that refused to heal. Eliza had returned to the house with good intentions. She was a woman of strength and faith, determined to reclaim her family's legacy from the grip of superstition. But what she found within those crumbling walls was far more powerful than any ghost story. The mansion's air carried a heaviness, a stillness that seemed almost alive. Every door creaked as if whispering secrets. The portraits of the Dellinger ancestors, though coated in dust, seemed to watch her every move. She would sometimes find furniture shifted from where she'd left it, or objects placed in peculiar arrangements, old coins stacked in perfect towers, feathers laid in crosses on the floors. Her son, Samuel, only 10 years old at the time, was the first to feel the weight of the curse. From the very night they arrived, the boy complained of whispers in the dark, voices calling his name from the direction of the ruined barn. He told his mother that something lived beneath the house, and that it wanted him to come outside after midnight. Eliza tried to comfort him, blaming his vivid imagination, but soon even she began to hear things. Footsteps pacing above her room when no one was there, the sound of someone humming an old tune she couldn't recognize, doors that opened on their own. In her desperation, she reached out to a local priest, Father Merrin, who agreed to bless the house. The blessing ceremony was short-lived. As he began to recite the prayer, the air turned unbearably cold. The flames in the candles flickered and then extinguished completely. The priest stopped speaking, his face pale with fear, and whispered that something in that house did not want to be named. He left immediately and refused to return. From that day forward, Eliza and Samuel were alone. The boy's behavior grew increasingly disturbing. He would disappear for hours and reappear covered in dirt, his hands blackened with soot. He claimed he was helping them rebuild. When Eliza asked who they were, he only smiled and said, "The ones who came before me." His drawings, once innocent sketches of animals and fields, became dark depictions of figures standing in circles, surrounded by symbols and fire. Eliza found one particular drawing that chilled her to the bone. It was of the family barn, fully restored, with Samuel standing inside holding a candle while shadowy figures surrounded him. Everything came to a horrifying climax on the night of October 3rd, 1862. Eliza woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of soft chanting echoing through the house. Samuel was gone. Panic gripped her as she followed the faint light coming from the direction of the barn ruins. There, amid the smouldering remains, she saw her son standing barefoot in the center of a glowing circle etched into the dirt. Around him were the same sigils carved into Elias and Jonathan Dellinger's bodies, symbols that no one had been able to interpret. His eyes were open but lifeless, his lips moving soundlessly, as if repeating a prayer not meant for human tongues. Eliza rushed forward, screaming his name. The candle in his hand went out, and an unnatural silence fell. The next thing she remembered was waking at dawn, her clothes torn and her hands burned. Samuel was gone. The barn was cold, and in the place where he had stood was a perfect black imprint in the dirt, as if something had burned him away without leaving a single ember. When neighbors found Eliza wandering the road hours later, she was incoherent, muttering that the boy had been taken. Doctors could find no injuries beyond exhaustion, but her mind was shattered. She was committed to the Harrisburg Asylum, where she spent the next 9 years repeating one line over and over: "The air must feed the land." The Dellinger estate was abandoned permanently after that. For decades, no one dared claim it, though a few brave travelers who passed by swore they saw a small boy standing in the ruins at night, holding a flickering light. Others claimed to hear the faint sound of a woman crying, echoing across the fields. To this day, the legend persists that Samuel Dellinger never died, that the curse took him as its own, binding his soul to the land, making him the eternal guardian of the family's blood debt. And with his disappearance, one truth became certain. No Dellinger heir ever truly escaped the legacy written in their blood. The land always took what it was owed, and Samuel had simply been the next payment in a cycle that would never end. By the late 1860s, the Dellinger estate was nothing more than a decaying skeleton, its walls bowed with rot, its windows blackened with grime, and the air around it thick with the stench of damp earth and something older, something foul. Yet the locals swore that even in ruin, the house was not empty. Some nights, when the fog rolled in thick over the fields, a dim orange glow could be seen flickering from the upper windows. Farmers said it looked like candlelight moving from room to room, as if someone or something still lived there. Those brave enough to walk near the property claimed to hear faint voices, the crying of a child, and the sound of footsteps pacing endlessly along the wooden halls. And then came the rumors that the curse was spreading beyond the Dellinger bloodline. It began with the townspeople. Within a few years of Samuel's disappearance, strange misfortunes struck those who had been connected to the family in any way. The carpenter who had repaired the estate gates was found drowned in a nearby stream, though his lungs contained no water. The blacksmith who had shod the Dellinger horses lost his sight after claiming to see a boy's face in the forge fire. Even Father Merrin, the priest who had attempted to bless the house, fell ill with a fever that caused him to scream the Dellinger name before dying in agony. The townsfolk began to whisper that the curse had grown restless, hungry now for more than just Dellinger blood. Stories spread of travelers vanishing along the road that passed the estate. One account, recorded in the 1870 parish log, told of a merchant from Harrisburg who stopped near the Dellinger property to rest his horses. His coach was later found abandoned, the animals dead, and the seats covered in a thin layer of black ash. The merchant himself was never seen again. Another tale described 2 boys who dared each other to enter the barn ruins. One returned pale and silent, while the other was found days later, hanging from a tree near the river, his eyes open wide as if frozen in terror. He had carved one word into the bark beneath him: awake. As fear spread, so did superstition. The townspeople began holding candlelight vigils at the edge of the Dellinger land, praying for protection from whatever evil lingered there. Some families moved away entirely, claiming that the very soil had become poisoned. Others swore that the valley's crops began to die the closer they grew to the Dellinger property, as if the curse was seeping into the earth itself. Even animals avoided the area. Crows circled above the mansion but never landed, and dogs refused to cross the property line, growling and whimpering as if sensing something unseen. The estate had become more than a haunted house. It was now an infection, a wound that bled misfortune into everyone around it. And yet, amid all the fear, one man saw opportunity. In 1870, a historian and spiritualist named Dr. Abram Voss traveled to Lancaster County after hearing the legends. He believed the Dellinger curse was not divine punishment, but the result of ancient ritual practices, remnants of old European occultism brought over by Heinrich Dellinger himself. Against the warnings of the townsfolk, he set up camp in the old mansion, determined to uncover the truth. For weeks, Dr. Voss documented his findings: strange carvings beneath the floorboards, bones buried near the foundation, and hidden symbols etched into the fireplace stones. In his final journal entry, he wrote, "The house speaks through the blood. I hear it now. It knows my name." The following morning, a traveler passing through reported seeing smoke rising from the estate once more. When authorities arrived, they found the historian's belongings scattered, his tent shredded, and his notes burned to ash. His body was never recovered. That incident sealed the Dellinger legend permanently in local folklore. The authorities closed off the property, and no one was allowed near it again. The few remaining neighbors abandoned their farms, leaving the land to silence. Over time, nature consumed what was left. The house collapsed into itself, the barn crumbled completely, and the Dellinger estate vanished beneath weeds and trees. But the stories didn't stop. Even decades later, travelers passing through the valley claimed they could still hear the echo of a woman's screams, a child's laughter, and the faint hum of a voice repeating words in a language no one understood. The curse, it seemed, had not died with the family. It had simply gone quiet, waiting, patient as the soil itself. And though generations would pass, the people of Pennsylvania knew better than to disturb the Dellinger grounds. For in that place, time had stopped, and the sins of the past still whispered through the wind, reminding anyone who listened that blood never forgets, and the dead never truly rest. By the dawn of the 1880s, the Dellinger estate had become nothing more than a ghost story, whispered in taverns and church basements, a cautionary tale parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far at night. The once grand property was overgrown with thorn and ivy, its ruins hidden beneath the earth like an old scar the land was trying to conceal. Yet not everything was forgotten. Those who dared to visit the site after sunset swore that something still stirred there, an ancient presence, heavy and aware. And though decades had passed since the last Dellinger heir vanished, the curse was not finished. The land still waited for another to carry the bloodline's burden. It was in 1883 that the next chapter of the Dellinger legacy began, when a distant descendant named Caroline Dellinger, unaware of her family's haunted past, arrived from New York to claim what she thought was a small inheritance. She was an artist and writer, fascinated by American folklore, and had grown up hearing faint mentions of the family curse, though she'd always dismissed it as myth. When a legal letter arrived informing her that she had inherited land in rural Pennsylvania, she saw it as an opportunity, a retreat where she could write her next book. When Carolyn reached the town nearest the old estate, she was met not with welcome but with fear. The locals refused to speak of the Dellinger property. An old innkeeper warned her to turn back before the house remembers your name. But Caroline, curious and defiant, pressed on. When she finally arrived, she found the land covered in fog, the remains of the mansion standing like the bones of some massive creature long dead. The roof had caved in, the doors hung open, and the surrounding trees leaned inward as if the forest itself was watching her. Her first nights were filled with strange dreams. She wrote in her journal that she often woke to the feeling of someone standing beside her bed, though no one was there. She heard the distant sound of a child humming a lullaby, and sometimes the low murmur of men's voices coming from beneath the floor. Still, she remained skeptical. She believed the eerie sensations were the product of suggestion, the power of the mind to conjure fear in lonely places. But as the days went on, the events grew too real to ignore. One evening, while exploring the ruins of the barn, she uncovered something half buried in the dirt, a small, rusted pendant shaped like a serpent biting its own tail. When she picked it up, she said she heard a voice whisper, "Welcome home." That night, she dreamed of a long table surrounded by people in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and expressionless. At the head of the table sat a man with empty black eyes, raising a goblet of blood. He smiled at her and said, "You've kept us waiting." Caroline's journal entries from that point grew increasingly fragmented. She wrote of losing time, of waking up covered in ash, and of seeing her reflection move independently in mirrors. At one point, she recorded that the ground near the barn had begun to breathe, pulsing like something alive beneath the soil. She described hearing her name whispered by dozens of voices at once, followed by a child's laughter echoing through the house. The locals, hearing of her strange behavior, tried to intervene. A group of men visited her to convince her to leave, but when they arrived, the house was empty, no sign of Caroline, just her open journal lying on the table. The last line written read, "The blood remembers." Weeks later, a search party found a trail of footprints leading from the house to the ruins of the barn, where the earth had been freshly disturbed. Beneath the soil, they found fragments of clothing, a rusted pendant, and bones so small that the coroner could not say whether they belonged to a child or a woman. No one returned after that. The property was sealed by local authorities and marked as condemned, but the people of Lancaster County swore they could still see her. Some said a woman's figure could be seen standing by the barn on foggy nights, her dress tattered and her face hidden behind her long hair. Others claimed to hear her humming the same lullaby Samuel Dellinger once sang before he vanished. Those who got too close said she would turn to look at them with eyes black as tar and whisper, "It's your turn now." Caroline's fate became the final known link in the Dellinger chain. But the curse didn't end. It merely shifted, growing quieter, deeper, as if waiting for time itself to bring forth another heir. The locals began saying that every few decades, a stranger with the Dellinger name would unknowingly pass through Pennsylvania, drawn by something unseen. And though the house may have fallen, its memory, its hunger, still lingered, calling to the blood that had once promised it everything. The Dellinger curse was never about ghosts or vengeance. It was about inheritance. And inheritance, as history proved, could never truly die. The story of the Dellinger curse might have ended with Caroline's disappearance, if not for the arrival of Father Abel Corcoran, a young priest from Philadelphia who had heard whispers of the family's unholy line. In 1891, driven by both faith and curiosity, Father Corcoran traveled to Lancaster County after reading an obscure church record about the Dellingers, a record that mentioned ritualistic practices and blood oaths disguised as ancestral blessings. The Vatican itself had once kept a file on the Dellingers, labeling them as a family touched by ancient sin. Abel, determined to uncover the truth, believed that if he could cleanse the estate, he might not only redeem the souls of the Dellingers, but also silence the evil said to linger there. When he arrived at the edge of the old Dellinger property, locals warned him against entering. They told him of the strange lights that flickered at night, of the sounds of chanting that rose from beneath the ground, and of travelers who lost their way after venturing too close. But Father Corcoran was not easily swayed. Armed with his crucifix, holy water, and the diary of a former Dellinger servant, he made his way to what remained of the mansion. The air grew colder as he approached. He later wrote in his notes that the land itself seemed aware of my presence, and the wind carried whispers not made by men. Inside the mansion, Father Corcoran found decay and silence. The floors had caved in, and the wallpaper had peeled away like shedding skin. Yet what caught his attention most were the symbols carved into the walls. Circles filled with spiraling runes, the same design repeated again and again, leading toward what used to be the family chapel. The servant's diary, written decades earlier, had mentioned that the Dellingers gathered in the chapel not for prayer, but for blood rites to preserve the line. The priest felt his resolve falter for the first time, but he pressed on, whispering prayers under his breath. In the chapel's remains, he found something impossible, a small altar of blackened stone, untouched by time. The room smelled of copper and decay. On the altar lay a human jawbone, wrapped in faded velvet and bound with what looked like dried vine. Father Corcoran recognized the same Ouroboros symbol, the serpent eating its own tail, carved into the bone. He sprinkled holy water over the altar, and as the drops hit, the stone hissed like hot iron. The air grew thick, and a low hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls. He described it as a sound not meant for human ears. That night the priest stayed inside the ruins to perform an exorcism. He recited prayers through the dark hours, but the deeper he went into the ritual, the louder the noises became. He heard footsteps circling him, though he saw no one. At one point his candle was blown out, though there was no wind. Then, as the clock struck midnight, he heard a woman's voice whisper from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." He turned toward the sound and saw, for just a moment, a pale figure standing at the far end of the chapel, tall, thin with hollow eyes and a faint red glow around her. She was watching him, her lips moving silently, as though repeating his prayers in reverse. Father Corcoran tried to continue the ritual, but his voice trembled. The diary he carried was suddenly torn from his hands and thrown into the corner by a gust of air. Then came the screams, not from the figure but from beneath the floor. The priest later described them as the cries of those buried alive. Desperate, he cast his crucifix toward the apparition, shouting, "The blood ends here." The figure smiled, and with a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, she answered, "Blood never ends." When morning came, Father Corcoran was found outside the property by a search party of local men. His hair had turned completely white, and he clutched his cross so tightly that it left marks in his palms. He refused to speak for weeks, and when he finally did, he told the church that the evil at the Dellinger estate could not be exorcised because it was not bound to place. It was bound to blood. The church sealed his report, labeling it as spiritual trauma, and ordered that no further investigation be made. But those who knew the priest before the journey said he was never the same. He moved to a monastery in Vermont and spent his final years in near silence. On his deathbed, he asked for his final confession to be written down. His last words were, "It wasn't the house that was cursed. It was the family's blood that fed it. And somewhere it still thirsts." Years later, when the ruins were finally cleared to make way for farmland, the workers uncovered something under the chapel's foundation, a hidden staircase descending deep into the ground. The air that rose from it was cold and foul. At the bottom, they found the remnants of a circular room filled with carved symbols, candle stands, and a massive slab stained dark with age. Though no one dared to speak of it publicly, a local historian who visited the site described what he saw in a letter. It was not a place of worship. It was a place of feeding. Whatever Father Corcoran had tried to banish still lingered, sleeping beneath the soil. And as time moved on, the Dellinger name faded from records, but never from the land. Some say the priest succeeded in silencing the curse for a time. Others believe he only awakened it. But one thing remains certain. Whatever was buried beneath that estate was not meant to be found, and those who sought to end it only became part of its story. By the mid-1890s, the Dellinger name had almost vanished from public records. Yet the land where their mansion once stood refused to stay silent. Locals often reported strange lights flickering across the ruins, as though unseen fires burned beneath the soil. Some said the air above the property shimmered on certain nights, the way heat distorts vision, while others claimed to hear a faint heartbeat when they pressed an ear to the ground. The whispers grew stronger after the discovery of Father Corcoran's underground chamber. The site was abandoned once more, but history, as always, has a way of dragging its darkness into the next generation. In 1898, a new family purchased the surrounding farmland, the Whitlocks. They were simple people, German immigrants who knew nothing of the land's haunted reputation. They built a small home near the edge of the Dellinger ruins, drawn by its cheap price and fertile soil. For the first few months, life seemed normal. They grew corn, raised livestock, and lived quietly. But that peace ended one autumn evening when their eldest son, Thomas, came running from the fields, pale and trembling, claiming he had seen people burning in the earth. At first, his parents dismissed it as childish imagination, but soon the animals began to act strange. Horses refused to enter the barn, dogs howled at nothing, and chickens stopped laying eggs. The family began to hear whispers at night, voices calling from the cornfields, repeating their names softly over and over. Then came the dreams. Mrs. Whitlock later told a neighbor that she and her husband both dreamed of a great fire consuming their home, with dark figures watching from within the flames. Each time they woke, they smelled smoke, though no fire had burned. By winter, the Whitlocks were no longer the same. Visitors described the family as distant, hollow-eyed, and fearful of the night. One neighbor, curious and worried, went to check on them after seeing strange orange light flickering through their windows. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. The farmhouse was engulfed in flames, yet the fire seemed unnatural, silent, slow, and burning a deep red rather than orange. When townsfolk arrived, they struggled to extinguish it, though there was little wind and no reason for it to spread so fast. When the flames finally died, what remained inside didn't make sense. The walls of the Whitlock house were covered in symbols, the same circular runes once carved into the Dellinger chapel. On the floor, in a pattern of ashes, was the Ouroboros, drawn perfectly as if someone had taken hours to craft it. There were no bodies, only charred footprints leading out the door and vanishing into the frozen field. The fire inspector called it impossible. There had been no oil, no accelerant, no cause that could explain such destruction. Yet the strangest thing of all was what they found buried beneath the ashes. A silver locket engraved with the initials C.D., Caroline Dellinger. The town fell into panic. Some believed that the Dellinger curse had awakened again, feeding on the blood of new families that dared to live on its soil. Others claimed the Whitlocks had been possessed, repeating the ancient rituals of the Dellingers unknowingly. The local sheriff tried to suppress rumors, calling it an accidental fire, but word spread fast. Within weeks, the nearby towns were deserted after dark. No one dared pass the Dellinger ruins. In the following years, more fires occurred, each one connected to the cursed property. In 1903, a barn burned down without cause. In 1906, a traveler disappeared near the site, leaving behind only a blackened lantern. By 1910, the state declared the land unfit for habitation after multiple reports of spontaneous combustion and unexplainable heat bursts. The soil itself, some said, felt warm to the touch even in the dead of winter. A century later, modern researchers would return to the Dellinger site with ground-penetrating scanners, hoping to prove or disprove the legends. What they found was chilling. Beneath the earth lay a massive stone foundation, far larger than any mansion ever recorded on property deeds. It was circular, with multiple chambers radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. In the center of the structure was a large depression filled with metallic residue and ash. Scientists could not explain the readings. The ground registered high levels of electromagnetic activity, as if energy still pulsed below the surface. Some paranormal investigators who entered the ruins reported the scent of burning wood and iron, even though nothing burned nearby. Their recordings caught faint whispers repeating phrases like, "We remain, and it must continue." A few of them experienced burns on their hands that appeared hours later, small circular marks resembling the Ouroboros, the recurring fires, strange markings, and physical phenomena all seemed to echo one truth. The Dellinger curse was not simply a legend of ghosts or demons. It was energy, alive and ancient, feeding through bloodlines and the land itself. What had once been born out of ritual had become self-sustaining, a living entity bound to memory, soil, and flame. Each generation that tried to erase it only added to its strength. Even now, locals claim that during heavy storms, lightning never strikes anywhere near the Dellinger grounds. It bends away, as if avoiding something sacred or something forbidden. And on cold nights, when the fog rolls through the fields, travelers say they can see flickers of red light moving beneath the ground. Like embers waiting to ignite again, the curse didn't die with the Dellingers. It simply changed shape, waiting, as it always had, for the blood to call it home once more. It was the summer of 1912 when the Dellinger estate was finally scheduled for full excavation. Decades of fear had left the land untouched, but a wealthy industrialist named Harold Whitaker, known for his fascination with cursed properties, purchased the acreage. Determined to unearth the myth and end the superstition, Whitaker was no believer in ghosts or curses. He was a man of science, obsessed with exposing what he called rural hysteria. So, when his team of laborers began to dig through the foundations of the old Dellinger mansion, he expected to find nothing more than broken stone, rotted timber, and forgotten relics. What they uncovered instead would make even the most skeptical man question what he knew of the world. On the third day of digging, the men found what appeared to be a sealed cellar door beneath the collapsed floorboards of what was once the Great Hall. The wood was reinforced with iron bands and covered in centuries of compacted dirt. It took hours to pry it open, and when they finally did, a wave of stench rose up, thick, rotten, and unmistakably human. One worker vomited on the spot. Whitaker, covering his mouth with a handkerchief, ordered lanterns to be lowered into the darkness. The narrow stairs descended deep, much farther than any ordinary cellar. The air was heavy and wet, and the flickering lantern light revealed what looked like symbols carved along the walls. Hundreds of them, spiraling, overlapping, forming the same ancient patterns the priest had described decades earlier. When the men reached the bottom, they found themselves standing in a long corridor leading to a circular chamber. Inside that chamber were tables and wooden crates stacked against the walls. Whitaker ordered them opened, expecting to find wine bottles or old family possessions. Instead, the crates contained heirlooms, rings, necklaces, watches, all coated with a fine layer of dried brown dust that under the light looked disturbingly like blood. But it was the objects at the room's center that froze them all in place. A large oak chest, and beside it, a wooden chair with leather restraints bolted to the arms and legs. Beneath the chair lay a pool of hardened black residue, as if something had burned there long ago. Whitaker, ever the skeptic, brushed it off as evidence of some morbid ritual performed by desperate or superstitious ancestors. He laughed at the workers' unease and began to inspect the oak chest himself. The lock had long rusted away, but when he pried it open, a chill filled the air so suddenly that the lanterns flickered out. When light returned, what they saw inside turned their skepticism into horror. The chest was filled with dozens of small bones, human bones, arranged neatly in rows. Each bone had been engraved with the Ouroboros symbol, burned deep into the surface. And at the bottom of the chest lay a faded parchment covered in Latin script. Whitaker, unable to read it, took it to a local scholar who translated it days later. The translation read, "Those who bear the mark must feed the blood that binds them. Lest the curse devour the line." The discovery made headlines in nearby towns, and soon curiosity seekers began to flood the site. But their interest turned to terror after what happened next. The night following the chest's removal, a fire broke out in Whitaker's temporary encampment. The flames consumed his entire tent and spread to the nearby supply shack. The workers barely escaped, and when they searched for Whitaker's body, they found him seated upright in his chair, untouched by flame, but his skin was covered in strange black symbols, the same runes that had been carved into the cellar walls. His eyes were open, and in his right hand he clutched one of the bones from the chest. The coroner who examined him said there were no signs of burns, suffocation, or trauma, just an expression of pure terror. His death was ruled as heart failure, but the workers knew better. Terrified, the excavation was abandoned. The remaining artifacts were buried back into the earth, sealed beneath stone and cement by order of the local authorities. The official report claimed unstable ground conditions as the reason for closure, but privately the sheriff warned his men never to step foot on that property again. A few of the laborers who had handled the relics began to fall ill within weeks. Their skin blistered, and their dreams were filled with fire and whispers. 2 of them vanished without a trace, leaving their belongings behind. Years later, in 1928, a team of historians studying Pennsylvania's haunted sites revisited the Dellinger records. One of them, a professor named Daniel Hart, managed to access the sealed police documents from Whitaker's excavation. In his notes, he described photographs that were never made public, images of the underground chamber, the blood-stained chair, and the chest of bones. But there was one photo that disturbed him above all others, a blurry image taken just before the fire, showing the excavation crew standing beside the open chest. Behind them, barely visible in the darkness of the tunnel, was the outline of a figure, thin, tall, and draped in what looked like the shredded remnants of an old gown. Its eyes were two hollow voids reflecting the lantern light. After that, Professor Hart withdrew from his research, claiming he had been visited in dreams by the Dellinger woman. His final journal entry read, "The heirlooms were not trophies. They were offerings, and the house was never a home. It was a vessel." When the land was later sold again, construction workers discovered that every attempt to rebuild on the site failed. Foundations cracked without reason, machinery malfunctioned, and workers complained of hearing breathing beneath the soil. To this day, that area remains undeveloped, just an empty patch of land fenced off and forgotten, where nothing grows. But every few years, someone claims to find something unearthed after a storm, a rusted ring, a locket, a knife, or a child's toy, all stained, all engraved with the same ancient mark. Locals warn not to touch them, because the curse doesn't rest in the mansion or the ruins. It rests in what the Dellingers left behind. Their heirlooms were not keepsakes of memory. They were containers of sin, and every object still whispers the same silent promise written on that cursed parchment: the blood must feed. The Dellinger family's curse had persisted for nearly a century, but by the time the final heir, Jonathan Elias Dellinger, was born in 1915, the world had changed. The age of superstition was giving way to science, and people had begun to dismiss the Dellinger curse as folklore. Jonathan himself, raised in Philadelphia by distant relatives who kept the family name quiet, grew up believing that the stories of his ancestors were nothing but old ghost tales told to frighten children. Yet even as a child, there were signs that the darkness hadn't truly died with the past. He was born under strange circumstances. His mother claimed the sky turned red during her labor, though no one else in the city saw it. His father, a quiet man of business, refused to speak about the family's Pennsylvania roots, burning every letter and document that mentioned the old estate. But Jonathan was a curious boy, and by the age of 16, he had already found newspaper clippings and church notes about the cursed Dellinger. Property, what began as fascination, soon turned into obsession. When Jonathan's parents died in a car accident in 1932, he inherited their modest estate, and as fate would have it, a sealed letter that had been passed down through generations. The envelope was yellowed and brittle, marked only with the family crest and a faint Latin inscription, "Sanguis vocat sanguinem," blood calls to blood. Inside was a single page, handwritten in ink so dark it appeared almost burned into the paper. It contained only 2 sentences: "Return it to the earth, and you will free us all. Fail, and it will claim you next." At first, Jonathan dismissed it as melodramatic nonsense, but the next morning he woke to find the letter lying open on his desk again, though he had locked it in a drawer the night before. That night, he dreamed of the Dellinger mansion, though he had never seen a photograph of it. In his vision, the walls were covered in red moss, and the floor beneath him was breathing, expanding and contracting like lungs. A voice whispered through the dark, "Come home, Jonathan. We've waited." Unable to shake the images, he began researching the family's history in earnest. The more he read, the more he realized the strange coincidences. The fires, the deaths, the disappearances formed a pattern. Every few decades, a Dellinger heir would return to the family land, whether by choice or by fate, and none ever left alive. The last documented event was the excavation fire of 1912, the same year his grandfather had vanished. Jonathan, logical and skeptical, decided to confront the legend directly. He believed that the only way to end the superstition was to face it himself. In October 1935, he traveled to Lancaster County with nothing but a journal, a revolver, and the cursed letter. The locals refused to help him find the exact site, so he followed the old property maps alone. By the third day, he found it. The land overgrown and desolate, a faint stone outline marking where the mansion once stood. He camped there for the night, determined to spend one full evening on the property to prove the curse was just a myth. At midnight, he began hearing whispers. They came from the earth itself, rising like steam. His lantern flickered, and he saw shapes moving beyond the trees, figures dressed in tattered 19th-century clothes, their faces blurred by shadow. He wrote in his journal that the ground seemed alive, like a great heart beneath the soil. The whispers grew louder until they became screams. He shouted into the darkness, "I'm the last! You can't have me!" The wind stopped. For a long moment there was silence. Then from beneath his feet a voice spoke, deep, resonant, and unmistakably human. Then end it. Jonathan realized what the letter had meant. Return it to the earth. He dug into the ground with his bare hands, the soil unnaturally warm and slick. Beneath the surface, he found something solid, a small iron box engraved with the serpent Ouroboros. He pried it open and saw inside the same symbols described by Father Corcoran decades earlier. But before he could destroy it, the earth trembled. He fell backward as the box pulsed with light, and a figure began to rise from the ground. A woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes black as ink. She whispered, "You carry our blood." Jonathan screamed and fired his revolver, but the bullets did nothing. The woman only smiled, her voice echoing all around him. "You cannot kill what was born of you." The air thickened, the wind roared, and the trees bent inward as though drawn toward the center of the field. Jonathan threw the box into the hole and set it ablaze with oil from his lamp. The ground shook violently, flames spiraling upward, forming faces of every Dellinger before him, burning, crying, watching. Then all at once it was over. The fire went out, the wind stopped, and the night was still. The next morning, a farmer passing by found the remains of Jonathan's campsite. His belongings were intact, but there was no trace of him, only a circle of scorched earth where the fire had burned, and at its center, a single object half buried in the dirt, the Ouroboros pendant. Jonathan's journal was later recovered from a nearby creek. Its last entry read, "It's done. I heard them scream, and then I heard silence. The ground closed. If I die here, let no one come after me. The blood must sleep." After his disappearance, no one from the Dellinger line was ever recorded again. The name vanished from census records, and the mansion's ruins were finally swallowed by the earth. But even decades later, travelers through Lancaster still speak of that field, how the air grows hot near its center, and how sometimes, late at night, you can hear a voice whisper from the soil. He tried to end it. He failed. Perhaps Jonathan succeeded in breaking the curse, or perhaps he only gave it what it wanted, a final heir's blood to complete the circle. Whatever the truth, the Dellinger legacy ended where it began, in the dark soil of Pennsylvania, where blood remembers and fire never truly dies. In the decades following Jonathan Elias Dellinger's disappearance, the legend of the cursed bloodline began to fade into obscurity. The world was changing. 2 world wars, industrial expansion, and the birth of modern skepticism buried old folklore under layers of reason. The Dellinger land, long since condemned, was eventually absorbed into the state's forestry division, marked only as uninhabitable marsh. But even as the earth reclaimed what it had devoured, the whispers never stopped entirely. Locals swore that on windless nights, the trees still murmured a name, Dellinger, and strange fires would flicker beneath the fog. By 1954, Most people considered the curse little more than a ghost story. That year, a team of geological surveyors arrived in the area, tasked with mapping groundwater channels beneath the valley. They had no knowledge of the Dellinger name or its history. They were scientists, not storytellers. On their second week of drilling, the crew reported hitting a hollow space beneath the ground at precisely the same coordinates where the Dellinger mansion had once stood. The lead engineer, Thomas Greer, ordered a small camera probe lowered into the cavity. What it revealed chilled even the most rational minds among them. The footage showed what appeared to be a vast underground chamber, perfectly circular, lined with black stone. In the center was something metallic, like a table or altar, still intact despite the decades. The chamber walls seemed to glisten, as though coated with a wet tar-like substance. But what startled them most were the carvings, runes, hundreds of them, etched into the walls in concentric rings. When the team played back the footage, a faint hum could be heard beneath the static, like the sound of distant chanting. Within days, one of the surveyors quit the project after claiming to have vivid nightmares about being buried alive. Another fell ill, developing strange blisters on his hands that formed circular patterns. The company quietly halted operations, sealed the borehole, and removed all equipment. The incident was officially written off as a geological anomaly, combined with toxic gas exposure. But rumors leaked through the small towns nearby. The story spread that something had been found beneath the earth, something that still breathed. Not long after, the strange occurrences began again. Campers passing through the woods reported seeing faint red lights in the distance, like lanterns swaying in an unseen wind. A few even spoke of hearing voices whispering from underground, calling their names. In 1956, a hunter was found dead near the site, his body intact, but his face frozen in horror, his hands covered in burn marks shaped like the Ouroboros. The police found no signs of struggle, no fire, no cause of death. They closed the case as cardiac failure, echoing the old verdict from Harold Whitaker's death decades earlier. In the 1970s, a small group of college students from a nearby university rediscovered the Dellinger story while researching Pennsylvania's urban legends. Fascinated, they decided to visit the site and document what they found. The leader of the group, a folklore major named Richard Heirs, kept an audio recorder during their exploration. The tape, now archived in a university library, captures several hours of static, distant footsteps and hushed laughter as the group jokes about the curse. Then midway through the recording, the laughter stops. Hayes' voice says, "Wait, do you hear that?" Followed by a faint whisper repeating the word, "return." The group fled soon after, but according to Hayes' later account, one of their friends, Margaret, began experiencing vivid hallucinations after the visit. She complained of hearing whispers in her sleep, of seeing faces in mirrors that weren't her own. She disappeared 3 months later, her car found abandoned near the Delaware River. By the 1990s, the Dellinger curse had evolved into an underground legend among paranormal enthusiasts. Teams with infrared cameras and EVP devices attempted to investigate the ruins, but nearly all of them reported the same phenomena: malfunctioning equipment, dead batteries, and a persistent low-frequency hum that seemed to come from beneath the soil. One investigator, a seasoned skeptic, described seeing shadows that didn't move with the light. Another recorded a voice saying, "We never left." Perhaps the most unsettling account came in 2004, when a construction company attempted to reroute a nearby highway. During excavation, workers unearthed a series of old blackened stones arranged in a perfect circle. Beneath them was a rusted iron cross, identical to one described in Father Corcoran's 1891 notes. The workers reported a sudden rise in temperature, an inexplicable burst of heat radiating from the ground. Within 24 hours, the site machinery began failing. One worker collapsed with severe burns on his palms, and the project was abandoned. The company quietly diverted the highway, leaving that stretch of forest untouched. Even now, over a century after Jonathan Dellinger's disappearance, the land remains forbidden. Government records list it as an unstable sinkhole zone, but no sinkhole has ever been documented there. Hunters avoid it. Locals warn travelers not to stray into the valley. Those who do report strange sensations, pressure in the air, flickering lights, and the smell of burning wood. Some say the curse ended with Jonathan's sacrifice. Others believe the blood he spilled merely sealed it deeper into the earth, where it waits, patient and eternal. A few researchers claim that every 30 years, the same span between the Dellinger tragedies, the phenomena flare up again, as if the curse breathes in cycles, like a living thing reawakening. Today, the Dellinger name is gone, erased from family trees and forgotten by time. But the land still remembers. Those who have stood near the ruins say they feel watched, as if the soil itself recognizes them. And on the rarest of nights, when lightning splits the sky above Lancaster, witnesses swear they see the silhouette of a grand house blazing with invisible fire, its windows glowing red, its doors wide open, waiting for another heir to come home. The curse did not die. It simply adapted. It hid itself in history, in silence, in bloodlines scattered and unknowing. And though the Dellinger family may be gone, the land still whispers their promise. Blood remembers. Blood returns. Even today, nearly 2 centuries after the first tragedy struck the Dellinger family, the legacy of their bloodline still lingers over Pennsylvania like a shadow that refuses to fade. The land where their mansion once stood has become a place most locals avoid, a stretch of dense forest that seems to breathe uneasily, where even the birds refuse to sing after dark. Though time has consumed the ruins, stories of strange happenings continue to surface, passed down from generation to generation like warnings disguised as folklore. In the small nearby towns, Lancaster, Mill Creek and Reading, the Dellinger name is spoken only in hushed tones. Some claim that the curse never ended, that it merely changed its form. Farmers speak of livestock found drained of blood with no trace of predators. Hunters swear they've seen ghostly figures in the mist, wearing old 19th century clothing. And travelers sometimes report hearing screams echoing through the woods on windless nights. For most, it's just a story, a cautionary tale about greed, sin, and the consequences of tampering with things not meant for human hands. But for others, it feels personal, almost as if the Dellinger curse was never meant to die with its family, but to spread quietly through those who dare to remember it. In 1998, a team of amateur ghost hunters from Philadelphia decided to investigate the so-called Dellinger Hollow. They brought along cameras, electromagnetic detectors, and a Ouija board, convinced they would find proof of the haunting. At first, everything seemed uneventful, until they reached the heart of the forest where their equipment began to malfunction. Their audio logs captured faint whispers, saying the words "air," "blood," and "return." One of the team members, a woman named Lydia, later claimed that as they were packing up, she saw a man standing among the trees, watching them silently. She described him as tall, wearing tattered 19th century clothing, with eyes that glowed faintly red. None of her friends saw him, but the video footage, blurry and unstable, showed a human-shaped shadow where she had pointed. 2 weeks later, Lydia vanished. Her car was found abandoned near the Pennsylvania Turnpike, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. The last thing she had written in her journal read, "He's calling me back to the house." Her case remains unsolved. By the 2000s, the Dellinger story had spread beyond Pennsylvania, becoming the subject of online forums, paranormal documentaries, and late-night podcasts. Some researchers claimed that every 33 years, the same cycle noted in old church records, a new tragedy would occur connected to the Dellinger land. Fires, disappearances, sudden madness, all documented within a few miles of the property line. Skeptics dismiss these patterns as coincidences, but even skeptics admit that something strange happens there. Electronic devices die, compass needles spin, birds go silent, and sometimes a low hum fills the air, as though the ground itself were vibrating with a pulse. In 2017, a construction company once again attempted to develop part of the old Dellinger estate, planning to build a rest stop along the highway. But after just a week of digging, the project was abruptly cancelled. Workers reported a strong sulfuric smell coming from the ground and said they found bones, small, blackened, and brittle, arranged in perfect circles beneath the soil. The state sent a team to investigate, but the official report only stated animal remains and geological disturbance. The site has been fenced off ever since, marked private property, no trespassing. Despite these warnings, a few curious souls still wander into the forest, hoping to glimpse the truth for themselves. Some emerge shaken, claiming to have heard chanting or laughter echoing through the trees. Others say they felt hands brushing against them when no one was there. A few never return at all. The police label it as lost hikers, but locals whisper another explanation, that the Dellinger land claims anyone foolish enough to disturb it even more. Unsettling are the reports from descendants who bear the Dellinger name without knowing it. Genealogical researchers have traced parts of the bloodline through marriage records, discovering that the family didn't entirely die out. Their descendants scattered, changing names to escape the curse. Yet strange misfortunes still seem to follow those who share the blood. Unexpected deaths, unexplained visions, recurring dreams of fire and water, and an unshakable fear of being watched. One woman in Ohio, unaware of her connection, wrote on an online forum that she'd been haunted for years by nightmares of a house that burns endlessly but never falls. Her ancestry test later revealed a link to the Dellinger line. Today, the locals call it the land of the doomed heirs. It's a place no one builds upon, where even the trees twist in unnatural shapes as if recoiling from the soil. At night, the fog thickens into shapes that look almost human, and some say that if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint clinking of metal chains beneath the earth, like restless souls bound by their family's sins. The Dellinger curse has become more than a legend. It's a warning. It reminds people that evil doesn't always die with those who commit it. Sometimes it roots itself deep in the earth in memory and blood and waits. And while the Dellinger name may have been erased from records, its story still breathes in Pennsylvania's cold wind, carried in whispers that sound eerily like the past refusing to rest. Those who know the story say that the curse isn't gone, it's only dormant, waiting for the next heir to unknowingly awaken it. And when they do, the ground beneath the old estate will stir once more. The fires will rise again, and the legacy written in blood will continue, exactly as it always has.